Welcome back, everyone, and well done on hanging in there. This has been a long day, and you've made it to the final session. And this is going to be a bit of a change of pace. We've listened for 2 days to the experts, the academics, the policy researchers, the policy makers. Now we turn to the media and the markets. This is the first time that this conference has had this session on writers and commentators, and we'll be interested to know afterwards what you think about it. But I think these are the people who we rely on, really, to share, to talk to the world about the issues that have been talked about at this conference for the past 2 days. And we have 3 different angles, if you like, on the issues. We have 2 journalists, one a broadcast journalist, being Nompu. I think the bios will come up, Nompu Siziba. The bios will come up as they speak, who is with the SABC, so TV journalism. Print and online journalism in the person of Tara Roos, who has also recently published a book called Where to From Here, which I imagine I would certainly want her to talk about. And then Mamokete Lijane, who has been a columnist for Business Day. She is taking a short break from her column writing, but in her day job, she's the head of strategy at Standard Bank Global Markets, which means she is involved in trading the markets and talking to financial markets players. And she has often told me she absolutely loves the bond market. So if you love the bond market, this is your person. So I hope that we can have quite an informal discussion. Some of these people are very expert question askers in their own right, and I've said to them they're welcome to ask questions of each other. And we will run with a few questions, and then I hope take questions from the audience. And I hope to take questions also from the back of the audience, because I know that's been a bit of a failure, certainly in the session I moderated yesterday. So we will try and come to you, and I'm going to jump straight in. Mamokete, the financial markets closely watch every payroll release every month from the US, and yet they don't take that much interest in South Africa's employment and unemployment quarterly figures. Why is that?
Good afternoon, everybody. So I think the economies firstly are structured differently, and employment numbers in the US mean different things to what employment numbers in South Africa mean. Not to say it's not the number of jobs, it's still the number of jobs, but in terms of the implications for the market, they're quite different. So the first thing to note is that in the US, the central bank, or the Federal Reserve as they call it, targets both inflation and employment. So what is happening in the employment market has got a direct impact on what policy is going to do. And so there's quite a straightforward feedback from jobs to policy, and therefore to how markets should calibrate. I also think the other issue is that in the US, the employment numbers give you a really good signal of what is happening in the underlying economy. We know that the US economy, in this way, it's like South Africa, it's about 60% household consumption driven. So to the extent that employment tells you something about what is going to be happening to consumption, it tells you a lot about how the economy is going to perform, and so people take a reading from that. One could argue there's no reason why it shouldn't be the same in South Africa. But I think in South Africa, because of the bifurcation in our economy, essentially, like we always talk about, like this 2-speed economy, a lot of demand, taxes, etc., is driven by what happens. It's highly concentrated. It's driven by what happens in the top 20% of the market. So in the rest of the 80%, you could have people losing jobs, gaining jobs, whatever the case may be. But those people are such low earners, and they have such a small impact on the aggregate economy, that they almost like the average number or the number of jobs or lack thereof is less important than, say, what is happening in the financial sector, where a lot of the taxes are, earnings, etc. So I think because our numbers that get released don't tell us this story, there's this aggregate number, but it doesn't really go into what is happening in the economy. Essentially, I mean, this is gonna sound callous, but if a poor person loses a job in South Africa, it doesn't really matter. So we've had a situation, for example, where personal income tax revenues have performed exceptionally well for multiple years, while employment has been languishing and unemployment has remained very high. But that's because the top end of the economy, those people are still getting more and more inflation-beating earnings. And so it doesn't really filter through back into what is happening to the underlying economy, essentially. But I also think, you know, if you look at that 20-80 split, for lack of a better word, it's probably, I could be more precise, but I'm going to stick with that. The average in South Africa economy doesn't exist. And to the extent that those numbers, when the employment numbers come out, are giving us an aggregate number, their meaning is very diluted in terms of what the implications are for demand.
Just following up a little bit, how much, your background is in economics, and you work in a sort of a dealing room, as it were. How much of this sort of economics, which is being discussed, employment, unemployment, do you talk to financial markets players about, and how do you translate these sort of sometimes quite difficult labor market kind of issues into terms that financial markets people can understand?
So I think from a financial markets perspective, everybody knows unemployment in South Africa is very high. Everybody knows that that is the base of the economy. So we don't worry about how things are, we worry about how things change. So we don't talk about employment very much, to the extent that it's already a known factor, right? It doesn't really change things in a particular way. I think the discussion around employment from an investor perspective is around the political stability and the stability of the political economy going forward, given what that unemployment signals around inequality and the fragility, therefore, of the social contract as a consequence. And so we, you know, the investor base thinks at some point South Africa is going to have to reckon with this, and that could be hugely disruptive from a policy perspective, because people that eventually are going to want equality, they're going to want for the right things to be done, and that's what people worry about. But in terms of whether unemployment is high in South Africa, everybody knows that that is the case, and it doesn't really affect your day-to-day. But I also think the other part of the unemployment story really speaks to the potential opportunity that is implied therein, to the extent that if you got people that are unemployed to become more active economically, you could probably unleash more economic growth. So that is also a story of potential. So there's this thing, it's a risk and it's potential, but for the time being, we know what it is, and it really, this is going to sound callous again, doesn't matter.
Yeah, but that sense of unemployment as much of a political risk to financial stability as an economic issue is a perfect place to jump off with Tara, whose book, which from here looks at the rise of populism and coalition politics. Tara, talk us through a little bit through how youth unemployment and unemployment generally plays out politically.
Youth unemployment has become a very politically divisive issue in South Africa. You know, if we look at the raw numbers, it's 4.7 million young South Africans who are unemployed and 10.6 million who are excluded from the labor market entirely. And populism thrives in an environment where people lose faith that traditional politics can improve their lives. populism thrives in this environment in which young South Africans go to school, they go to university, and they're unable to find jobs. And so these political parties and these movements that have very radical answers to complex problems become more appealing to them. And when we look at the rise of populism, it is directly linked to the government's inability to address key governance issues, this being unemployment, youth unemployment, crime. You know, if you had to walk down the street and you had to ask ordinary South Africans, what is the biggest issue facing you right now? It will almost certainly be either something related to crime or something related to the economy, whether it's economic stagnation, whether it's unemployment. And this is because it is a key governance issue. And with the inability to address those governance issues, South Africans are going to look for alternatives or stay at home and not vote at all because they cannot find a solution. And that is going to lead to further political fragmentation. And in the current political environment, we simply lack maturity in our coalition politics for the environment, particularly at a local government level, to be stable for many South Africans to say, actually, I trust this institution and I buy into this institution. And hope, you know, it's so important to the functioning of democracy. And when South Africans lose that hope and they lose faith in the government to effectively govern, we see this drastic rise in populist movements and populist political parties.
I want to come back to that, and I'm sure some of the audience will want to ask you some questions, but that is, Nompu, you're a television journalist. In fact, the SABC's reach is more than anybody else in journalism, really. How do you translate the unemployment crisis onto a TV screen?
Thanks very much, Hilary. Good afternoon, everyone. So when the stats come out, that's what they are. They're statistics. And what we seek to try and do is translate the statistics into human stories. So we generally try to speak to people who are affected by unemployment. They may be unemployed themselves. So you will speak to maybe an individual, their family, and the wider community. Because invariably what happens is that wherever you go, unemployment is a thing in a given area. And that has impacts in terms of the local economy, you know, people not thriving and people just eking out a living on whatever they're getting, whether it's social grants or, you know, a small anyana job here and there. So, so we try and go out. It doesn't happen all the time because it's resource dependent. It's also, you need to be able to cajole someone. Look, I'm doing a story about the unemployment figure. Can we talk to you about how this is affecting your life? And ideally, that's what we seek to do. So we get case studies so that we can put a human face on the numbers, because the numbers are humongous. By putting a human face on it, I don't know necessarily whether it has any impact anymore, because South African audiences do know, because your brother, your sister, your cousin will also be unemployed. So people are aware that this is a phenomenon, and there doesn't seem to be a light at the end of the tunnel, but we still seek, ideally, to put the human face and the impact on it.
And how do you cover solutions or potential solutions? And in other words, what are some of the challenges in getting policy, if you like, or policy efforts onto a screen?
So it's never a challenge to speak to policymakers or even academics like Professor Harim Barat, for example, who was speaking here yesterday when I was covering this meeting yesterday. And, you know, you get all the varying views, but of course the policy process is such a long one, isn't it? Because people have ideas, you know, people come up with white papers, things go through Parliament, and, you know, they may or may not finally get the stamp from the president. And then thereafter, you need the implementation. But I think South Africa does all the right things when it comes to policy. But of course, the issue is implementation. And I think that's the challenge over and over that we hear, that it's implementation. You know, to what extent do all the initiatives that are already in play actually help to dent the phenomenon that we have of, massive youth unemployment and broader unemployment as well.
I'm going to come to an issue which has been very much in the headlines, which has been mentioned also at this conference, which is the issue of migration and this notion that foreigners, and particularly foreigners from Africa, are taking our jobs. I mean, Tara, first of all, how widespread is that perception? But also, more relevantly, I mean, what is your view on that?
So the numbers are very clear. Migrants coming into this country is not the reason for our high unemployment and youth unemployment rates. Migrants who come into South Africa, they help the economy, they start businesses, they employ South Africans, they contribute to particularly the informal economy in South Africa. I think it is important that we do not disregard the very valid concerns of millions of South Africans who feel that illegal immigration is a security risk, because it is. We have very porous borders in South Africa, and it is a security risk not to know who is coming into your country, what they are doing, to have no control or tracking over illegal immigration. That is a genuine concern. But being a journalist, the most important question we ask ourselves is, what does the evidence tell us? And the evidence tells us that illegal immigration in particular is not an impediment to our economy. It is not the reason that our unemployment is one of the highest in the world. And, it is a very difficult balance because, when it comes back to the issue of populism, is that it is much easier to blame someone standing next to you than look at decades of weak economic growth, to look at bad governance and say, actually, what is the government doing to address this problem? It is much easier to scapegoat a vulnerable group. And it is very important for us as journalists to look at the numbers, to look at the evidence, and to bring that story to South Africans. The interpretation of South Africans is something out of our control, but it comes back to this issue that if the government will not govern, if they will not address key governance issues, we will continue to see the rise of things like populism, the rise of xenophobia, and these issues will continue to increase in South Africa, and so will the political volatility and the hatred that is being spread among South Africans until we address governance issues. And that ultimately is on the government.
Do you think, what role can journalists play in trying to address misperceptions, if you like?
You raise a very important issue that it's beyond the statistics. GDP can increase and South Africans still feel poorer. Interest rates can fall, inflation can fall, people still won't be able to find jobs. The ordinary South African is not thinking like a journalist, is not thinking like an economist. They don't care about GDP. To them, the economy isn't measured by GDP. It's measured by the cost of living. And it's very important for us, while reporting on the statistics and reporting on the evidence, because that is our jobs, to take into account the real perceptions of South Africans and their real lived experiences. Because I think when we come at these issues like xenophobia, like populism, and we address it with both the evidence and the compassion to South Africans to say, I understand your perspective, I think, that is really how we take a step forward as a country.
Mamokete, yes.
I just wanted to come in on this one also because I'm an immigrant, so I'm Sotho, and I grew up in Lesotho. That's where my home is, and I'm there all the time. Half my family lives in Botswana. I'm there all the time. I went to school in Swaziland, so I'm also there all the time. So I have a very regional view of unemployment. And we're here talking about youth unemployment, and I can tell you, in all the countries that I've just mentioned, they have exactly the same problem, if it's not arguably actually worse. So I think there's a regional problem here that we're not talking about, or I haven't been at a forum where we actually think about this as a regional issue with regional pressures. So if Zimbabwe's economy is completely dysfunctional, South Africa's dysfunction actually creates dysfunction in the neighboring economies to some extent. And so when you talk about immigration and you're like, oh, people must stop. So culturally, we grew up with a situation where people came to Gauteng to work. Whether you were coming from Swaziland, you were coming from Lesotho, this is where people came to work. You came to South Africa to work. So culturally, that's still the immigration pattern, as has been the case since you have industrialization in the region. And so I look at the whole thing about immigration and unemployment, and I don't think it's going to stop, regardless of how aggressive South Africa is around borders, etc. Because there are push factors within what is essentially not one country but one sort of labor market economy. And I'm just intrigued by that sort of integrated, more integrated look, as opposed to just it being about South Africa.
Sounds like there's a research agenda here for some of the people in the audience. I don't know that we've had much regional discussion in the past couple of days. Nompu, you are nodding. What are you seeing out there in terms of, migration?
I think
The issues are populism.
what Sis Mamokete was saying is correct, really. That it's easy just to look at your situation and not understand that you're located in a bigger picture. And I think there's a real issue around the importance of African unity and finding strategies to work together towards dealing with these, systemic problems. Because otherwise, if you're trying to fix things on your own, and yet you're aware of the backdrop, the history that Sis Mamokete is talking about, that traditionally South Africa has been the place that people come to. I think obviously a lot has changed in terms of the pie, just hasn't been growing, and therefore now you suddenly look at your neighbors and start blaming them because of the problems that you have, because the pie's not growing. It only grows for those, as she was saying, who are at the top. Those at the bottom just, eke out. So I think that there does need to be more of a regional approach to this particular issue. How that's done, maybe these very clever young economists can begin to do papers around that, because I think we're just going to keep on going in circles and circles. And it's not the first time that we've had a flare-up in terms of xenophobia. It happened in 2008, and it's happened even thereafter. It happens every now and again that things happen, forces come together, and suddenly there's this strong feeling against each other's neighbors or whatever it is, and people drift away. I know during COVID, for example, that was a health issue, of course. People did go back to their countries because they had no means of earning a living. So they went back to their countries, to Zim, Malawi, wherever it was. And when they found a gap, they came back and continued as per normal. But it's very complex. As Tara says, it's a very, very complex thing. And as the finance minister said yesterday, it needs all hands on deck to actually deal with it. But I think we need to be able to get from the point of just talking about things and coming up with ideas and actually implementing them.
I'm going to turn to one issue which has loomed quite large at this conference, which is the informal sector and informality. I don't know whether you've sort of followed the conference, but you may have followed the debate, and the point made by Professor Borat and others is that one of the big reasons for South Africa's youth unemployment problem is that we have very low rates of informality. And as he put it, South Africa looks a bit like Switzerland, and it really shouldn't. And I'm asking you, Tara, in a sense, how do South Africans look at the informal sector? Because, and I'm relating it back in a sense, some of the populism and the xenophobia tends to get turned precisely against some of those informal traders. And while the people in this room may say informality is one of the solutions, one of the big solutions to the unemployment problem, and it should be nurtured, if you like, that informal sector. What do you think the perceptions are out there, and how does it play politically?
I think many South Africans, particularly in the middle class, are very skeptical of the informal sector. But the informal sector plays an important role in every good, stable economy. But what we see in South Africa is that the informal sector is particularly vulnerable. You know, they face many structural barriers when we're looking at trading restrictions, licensing issues, just basic infrastructure. And there isn't really this government support of the informal sector when there largely should be. G20 was a really good example of this. We saw many informal traders and vendors shut down around the G20 Gallagher area because of the G20 event. And that had a drastic effect on, you know, the employees of the informal sector and the growth of the informal sector during that trade period. And when we look at these vulnerabilities, it is very important for us to take into account that not everyone is going to work for a big company. Not everyone is going to work for a massive corporation or work in government. The informal sector provides a very stable base for many young South Africans in particular to get their start, to get their foot into the job market, into the economy. And it's very important that we nurture and that we grow that. You know, the informal sector right now largely is viewed as the second-class economy in South Africa, and it shouldn't be. There shouldn't be these increased barriers around the informal sector, particularly in an economy like South Africa where growth is sluggish. We're in a position now where our economy isn't growing at the recommended 4 to 5% per GDP. And so we do need to have increased awareness around the informal sector, particularly at a government level, to say, how do we nurture and grow this aspect of our economy that is vital to us getting out of the sluggish stage and to even starting to chip away at our high youth unemployment rate?
Nompu, is this something that you cover as part of your economics coverage?
Well, you know, especially in areas like Gauteng, you know, there's been this big push to invest or to promote the township economy. And there are policies out there around the township economy, but the extent to which it's been a success, I'm not quite sure. And we haven't sort of done a holistic story about the success thereof. But yes, you know, we will go to, you know, stories that promote the township economy and talk about great things that have been done in certain corners, you know, in Gauteng, for example, around that. But I think that policies like that are good, but again, they need to be nurtured, and then, you know, money needs to be put in place to be able to encourage and invest in entrepreneurs who have great ideas, who can make their local areas buoyant and create jobs, et cetera, et cetera. But how widespread that has been, you know, it remains to be seen.
Last question, and then I'm going to open it for questions from the audience, so get ready. Mamokete, I'm going to ask you this one. I mean, to what extent what should government be doing about unemployment? And I ask because, you know, there's sort of, should government be focusing on enabling investment by the private sector? Should it be intervening directly to create employment or employment opportunities?
You should do everything. I don't know why you're choosing between those two things. You should, the whole thing, the hele lot. So I always say, you know, you can, as Reedy Club used to like to say, you can walk and chew gum at the same time. So there's no need to choose from one to the other. I think what government needs to do is to center employment absolutely in every single thing that they do. So apply that lens to every single policy that you do across all areas, right? Whether it be in economic spheres where you can say, okay, this is policy that is economic in nature, But then, even outside of like economic policy, in other policy spaces as well. And what that looks like is, you talk about whether they should be intervening directly. Obviously, to the extent that there's fiscal space and there are things that make sense to do, you want to be intervening directly because you want to try and assist people and get people out of abject poverty and get people into jobs, get people into the jobs market, get job support programs and all of that. So of course you want to do those types of things, no doubt. But then you also have to say, they were talking about OV now, which is a long-term sort of like removal of structural constraints to economic growth. Obviously, that's going to be jobs positive as well over time. But then when you look at, procurement policies, what is in those procurement policies? What are you doing within the labor market? Is that going to get more people employed? What are you doing around spatial planning? And I know that's part of what Treasury's, reform program is looking at. I totally like this idea of getting cheaper public transport, but the question also is, why are we moving so slowly on all of these things? I mean, like everything is like moving glacially, even the most obvious things. And then there's issues around, I think you were talking about that, Tara, around like licensing. For crying out loud, how hard can it be to change some of these rules? So I think we need to ask our public officials, our political leaders, to do the things that serve us at every single sphere and apply the same sphere and say, if you're in a municipality, what is council doing? Why are councils putting these bylaws in place? Why have we kept like apartheid state bylaws? Why? These are questions that we need to ask as citizens of our political representatives who make the laws that we need to live by. How have they applied that lens?
So Mamokete talks about a very important thing about municipalities. Yesterday I was busy interviewing the DG of National Treasury, not realizing that National Treasury had withheld funds from 69 municipalities. And thereafter, I had people on the phone saying, hey, did you speak to the DG about them? I'm like, no, I didn't. So, but anyway, that's a big story because that's the elephant as well in the room from a local economic perspective. Municipalities that are not functioning, municipalities year in, year out that are called out by the AG and don't seem to have to resolve their issues, from one year to the next. And if that isn't sorted out, it becomes problematic because people invest in communities, they invest in localities. And if municipalities are not working, then you're not going to have investment. I remember the story of the chicken people, Astra. They were based in a particular municipality, and they decided to disinvest from there because they weren't getting basics like water and electricity. And that affected jobs and so on and so forth. So there's so many layers of things that need to be attended to. And I think the municipalities is a key one. I'm interested to see what National Treasury is able to do with these 69 municipalities, because they've said, come to us, explain to us how you're going to use the money and that you're going to pay your service providers properly. Okay, fine, they do that. They say to Treasury what they want to hear, but then what happens thereafter? Because ultimately, this is a problem that is intrinsic, inherent, that has been there for a long time. You can't just say, I promise to do better and get the money and then repeat the same mistakes thereafter. So I think municipalities are a big one.
And Hilary, I think there was one question that was on the outline that you didn't mention, and I think it's particularly important that we bring it in now around, how does one communicate what could potentially be quite complex ideas. And I think it's become incredibly important that we communicate and help people understand how what is happening actually affects them ultimately. So we live in an environment where in a normal small municipality, people will be like, I don't have a job, and they'll go to the councillor and they'll say to the councillor, can you please give me a job? And our job is to get the message to people that what you need to be asking your councillor for is for them to change the bylaws. So you don't ask them for a job, you ask them to change the bylaws. And we need to make those linkages to people to say, actually, this is how this affects you and affects your neighbor and affects your community, and this is what you should be asking for. Simplifying those connections so people can actually see them, I think, is very important.
Yes. We've had a really freewheeling conversation, as you would expect from a bunch of writers and commentators. So you can ask freewheeling questions on
Somebody at the far end.
all of the topics we've covered. Okay, it's quite, hold on, I'm going to see. At the very back, I'm going to start. And then there's, at the side is number 2. Then number 3, and then I'll come to you, Visi, for online. So I've got 4 as far as I can see.
One there as well.
Not counting. Yes. So at the back first.
Right. Thank you very much for your insightful conversation. I just have 2 questions. One for Mamokete. Let me start first. In your statement, in your conversation, you were saying if, quote unquote, if a poor person loses his job, it doesn't matter. So my question is silence from government on mass general and youth unemployment a passive version of the statement that you said? And the second question to the whole panel is it right for me to say voter apathy among the youth is a consequence, a political consequence towards unemployment, which poses a political risk to political parties who wants to be voted? Thanks.
Will you, did you identify yourself?
I'm Kamagelo Modise from the Treasury.
Right, and questioners, please tell us who you are.
Thank you. This is Marius from University of the Western Cape. My question is on the elasticity of government's political system to the media pressure on key governance issues, and in this context, the issue of unemployment. Do you think there is some evidence or considerate evidence of the response from the political system or from the political side when it comes to the issue of unemployment, and whether how significant and impactful is that response? Thank you.
There was one over here. Yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Gracious. I'm doing a PhD in economics at Stellenbosch and studying South to South migration. Thank you for this refreshing session and for actually starting to talk about immigration. I just wanted to understand your view of how much of the anti-immigrant sentiment is due to the persistence of the legacies of apartheid, where we had the back gate system, where African immigrants were recruited via the back gate and could not get permanent citizenship, whereas the Western immigrants were considered to be skilled labor and could get citizenship. And now, after apartheid, we still have immigrants in the informal sector, and now they are competing with the South African population as well in that informal sector. So how much of that is due to the persistence of apartheid? Thank you.
Thank you. And Vusi, I think you're next with online questions.
Just one comment and 2 questions for you, Hilary, and the panel. The first one is a comment from Ntombikai Sekijana saying Mamokete talking about migration as a regional issue is so spot on. This is a legacy system, which is where conversations need to start. That is Ntombikai Sekijana. And the younger Majek asks a question to Tara is if undocumented migration is difficult to measure, how can we confidently conclude that immigration has little effect on unemployment? Let me repeat that. if undocumented migration is difficult to measure, how can we confidently conclude that immigration has little effect on unemployment? So ask Yangamajeke to Tara. And Zizipo Magaga starts by saying, South Africa has no shortage of policies, strategies, or research on youth unemployment. From your perspective, panel, what is the single biggest constraint preventing these from translating into meaningful employment outcomes for young people, and what should be prioritized to change that for over the next 5 years?
Lots of nice questions, and Mamokete, I think I may have to let you go first because...
Yeah, that was me under the bus. So I think, political systems respond to incentives and consequences. So to the extent that financial markets are agnostic of what is happening to the employment number, at least in the short term, obviously, we know that financial markets can provide an incentive, or consequences to bad policy that political systems then have to respond to. So if financial markets are looking at the unemployment story and not responding in the short term, then they're not playing that role of incentivizing or lack thereof a change in policy or a more strident response in policy, right? So the question really speaks to how do you get political incentives aligned, or political incentives aligned to our interests as citizens, and we have a democratic process, and so our means of doing that is the vote. So it really does come down to people voting and using their democratic voice in a way that is more strident, so they get the kind of policy responses that they would like. But financial markets, I'll give you an example about how colors they can be, right? If metals prices are rising, the rand will strengthen like it did in 2021 when Durban burnt. So that whole thing, markets just blinked through. And really it's because they capture a very narrow piece of information as far as the economy is concerned. They capture whether people who invest money are going to get their money back, and if it's going to be more than it was yesterday. How many South Africans are employed, whether people are happy, that doesn't feature.
Are there any other questions you want to pick up on at this point, and then I'll give the others a chance? 'Cause some of the questions were not directed
I think
at
the other one, this is me being really veering outside of my area of expertise, but I'll do that anyway. The whole idea about what is the biggest constraint to youth employment. I think the youth employment issue is not South African. It's not a SADC issue. It's not an Africa issue. It's not a global South issue. It's a global issue. So the same with immigration, by the way. The two seem to go together. So youth unemployment is a problem across multiple, especially countries that are in the emerging world. And it maybe speaks to something much more structural, and something that is not even about what's happening in South Africa per se, but it speaks to something about how economies function, how society has changed, how production operates, about what happens when you industrialize, but you're not actually absorbing labor, you're using more capital. I don't know what the answer is, but I do think to some extent, if we want to have a better understanding of what's going on here, to some extent we need to look outside of South Africa. Also Chinese competition, gutting manufacturing globally, so those jobs that are no longer available, that's the US story about why they now have Trump. So I think we do need to think about it a bit more broadly as an issue. And I mean, in other economies, they're talking about, Duncan is going to kill me, but that's why in Europe there's a big discussion around the basic income grant. So it's really, really speaking to these issues. When economies change and maybe utilize less labor, what are the other ways in which we can ameliorate suffering?
Tara, there were a couple of questions directly for you, but also pick up on any of the others which you...
So I'll start with the
to
immigration
answer.
question. Immigration in terms of raw numbers is not difficult to track in South Africa. The issue comes in, who are these migrants? What are they doing? You know, what is their formal address? Those are questions we don't have answers to because they are not documented and Home Affairs doesn't have that information. But if we're talking in terms of raw numbers, we know that migrants make up 2% of the population in South Africa, and we know this because of a variety of reasons. We know that migrant children are only 1% of our school system in South Africa. How do we know that? Because you don't need to be a documented citizen in this country to receive free basic education. It only becomes an issue when you get to matric and you don't have the correct documentation to register to write the National Senior Certificate exams. But to enter schooling in South Africa, you just need to be physically present in South Africa and have an address. So there is no level or barrier of entry to collect that data from schools. The exact same thing applies to clinics. At a clinic, they're not asking you if you're documented or not when you receive a service. You are simply going to that clinic to receive a service. And so Stats.SA is really a world-class organization and data collecting machine in South Africa. And so we know what the raw numbers are. The difficulty comes in, you know, if someone is undocumented in this country, how are they earning their income? Is it legal? You know, these are real security questions that we don't have the answers to. But in terms of the raw numbers and the impact of migrants in South Africa, we know the numbers on that. And the stats tell us that migration in this country and having undocumented migrants in this country is not the reason that we have high unemployment or high youth unemployment. Moreover, the economic situation we find ourselves today in South Africa is because of decades long of bad policy choices, of economic stagnation, of no growth in South Africa, of corruption. You know, these issues started way before many migrants arrived in this country. And there was a lot of fluidity of people going back to their country, of people coming back into South Africa. So, you know, the issue to say that we blame it on migrants and, you know, they're taking our jobs is just not even remotely close to the truth. Touching on young South Africans having political apathy, you know, unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, is political. And it's almost the cycle. You know, the inability to address governance issues leads to voter apathy, leads to people not voting, leads to more political fragmentation, which leads to more chaos in government, and the cycle just continues in that loop. And so it is really on South Africans, particularly young South Africans, to break that cycle. I mean, if we look at 2024, there were 11 million registered voters who did not vote. There were an additional 2 million South Africans who were eligible but not even registered. That's 13 million people that could have drastically changed the outcome of an election. And it's very easy to say, well, oh, my vote doesn't count and my vote isn't going to change anything. You know, 13 million people said that, and we look at the outcome of the country today. And so I think it's very important not to get discouraged by governance issues, because governance issues can be fixed. You know, the problems we have in South Africa are not out of this world. They're not anything unique to us as a country. There are solutions to them, and it is really about the political will of the government that we as South Africans vote into power to change those governance issues. And so I think that is particularly important. The question about elasticity in terms of government and our reporting on those issues, I think that, you know, government is incredibly transparent, particularly, you know, as someone who covers Parliament but covers the finance committees in Parliament and is really doing a lot of financial reporting. I think that there is a lot of transparency and a lot of openness, particularly from public servants. There's a very important distinction between the department and the ministry. And those who are politically appointed and those who are public servants and work in government departments. And I think, you know, particularly strictly speaking on public servants, they are very undervalued in South Africa and they do amazing work. And I think that there is genuine political will to try and fix the issues, but the political viability coming from those who are politically appointed, I think that's where the waters start to get very murky.
Nompu, and I don't know if you're Oh, I don't know that you're old enough to address the question about the apartheid legacy and how that may affect.
Well, I think I am old enough, but of course I'm aware of the history, but I was born somewhere else. I was born in the UK. But I think that the apartheid legacy obviously does play a role. In terms of one of the greatest obstacles for South African youth, I think we can't run away from the fact that the education system is not where it should be for the majority. I think for those people who are privileged, you can get first-class education in South Africa relative to the West, to what you can get in the West. First-class education, and you can compete with whoever, wherever you go in the world. But for the majority, I think the education is problematic. And I think that there are people out there who could get jobs, but they don't have enough money to get their drivers, get a license or whatever it may be. They don't have enough money to actually go to the internet cafe and go through, whatever they need to do to apply for jobs and so on and so forth. Speaking to what Mamokete was saying about the BIG, a basic income grant, there is an argument for it, but then of course, there's also the maths around it, around whether we can afford it as a country. We have a very thin tax base and so on and so forth. Can we really sustain that? Every year, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana tells us that, the SRD, we're not quite sure, that is the Social Relief of Distress Grant. We're not sure, we'll definitely have it next year, but we're not sure beyond that. So resources is a real thing, but I think that people's means to be able to actually look for jobs is a hindrance, and also education, because remember, we are now in the 21st century, we're talking about the fourth industrial revolution, AI, et cetera, and we have to be able to compete with the next man, north of Limpopo, as well as around the world. And the only thing that can enable you to compete is education.
AI, in fact, is the subject of tomorrow's discussion.
Can I just make also another contribution? I think what we should also note is that unemployment in South Africa does not present as equal across the board. It's highly variable depending on area. So unemployment in and around Cape Town is very low. In and around Gauteng is quite low. If you go to rural Limpopo, is extremely high. So there's also something, I think Ayabonga actually wrote a book talking about, I just don't remember the name of the book, but it was actually quite insightful, talking about the legacy of apartheid labor reserves and how,
Trawe?
Yeah, Trawe.
Okay.
Because, and we need to think about how that economy was structured, where development was concentrated, and that the experience of unemployment, etc., varies dramatically depending on the area. So even when you look at the aggregate number, there's still the 80-20 rule as far as South Africa's geography is concerned in terms of where that unemployment is concentrated as well. And I think it speaks to the idea about how does somebody look for a job if you're in rural Limpopo and municipal failures are probably a lot more of an issue for you, and how do you then move from where you are if there's this big spatial issues around moving from the rural area into an urban area where maybe employment opportunities actually exist. So I think there's a lot of nuance that we need to apply, and the solutions have got to address that as well.
I think that's all we have time for, and thank you so much to our panelists and also to our questioners from the audience. If you have more questions, please send them through. We can put you in touch. I think this has been a conversation which has brought in some fresh themes, or brought in some themes we've already touched on in a different way, and in a sense has been a bit of a call to action, among other things, to a lot of people in this room to go out and vote in the next round of elections, but also to look at unemployment as a regional issue, and I suppose to look at sometimes what it looks like on the ground, which is what some of the people on this panel get to do every day. So thank you very much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of the conference.